Yeah, thank you very much. In 1826, a 20-year-old grifter named Joseph Smith was arrested in Bainbridge, New York, on charges of being a disorderly person and an imposter, what we today would call a fraud. Court records referred to Smith as a glass looker because he was hired by a wealthy businessman named Josiah Stowell to act as a sort of treasure digger, specifically a psychic seer who would locate treasure by the gift and power of God. However, finding hidden treasures using supernatural devices like divining rods or seer stones has the same record of consistent failure as does faith healing. So Smith never actually found any treasure. Stoll's nephew recognized that Joseph Smith was defrauding his uncle and filed a legal complaint. There's an old adage that it is easier to lie to someone than to convince them that they've been lied to, and that was nicely illustrated here. Whether because of embarrassment or sunk cost fallacy or shame or simple credulity, it is often the case that the victim, a mark of a con job, doesn't realize that they've been had until everyone else points it out. So Stowell testified on Joseph's behalf about how these treasure digs worked. Smith said that he had a certain stone which he could put in a hat, and that he would put his face in the hat, and the stone would act like a crystal ball, showing him where to find hidden gold. And Smith had performed this supernatural service for Josiah Stowell several times, wherein Smith told Stowell where he could dig to find these treasures. Stowell paid Smith for the information, and dug where instructed, but never found any of the promised gold. Smith's father, Joseph Sr., testified on little Joey's behalf, saying that his boy really did possess the power and gift of God. Because of course he did. If it's true that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, then it's fair to assume that Joseph Smith Sr. was a crooked liar just like his son. Either he was just trying to save his own child, or he might have really believed that, because people can be really stupid, as my interlocutor will doubtless demonstrate for you tonight. Other witnesses testified that they were disgusted at the palpable deception that Smith used. Another stated that Joseph pretended to know the location of a buried treasure chest, that Joseph said that, as they kept digging for it, he said that the treasure chest kept settling away from them on account of an enchantment, such that no matter how deep they dug, the trunk kept repeating deeper, keeping about the same distance away from them, according to information that Smith pretended to get from the magic rock in his hat. So we're talking about imagined inanimate objects retreating as if consciously and allegedly magically to escape detection and hide further down in the earth. That anyone ever actually believed this is a testament to how stunningly stupid people can be. Smith played this con for years. In a few places, it was reported that Smith pretended to know where lost property of various kinds could be found in Palmyra, and that he used his seer stone pretending to know where coins were buried in Pennsylvania. But while he often collected payment for using this alleged psychic powers in this way, no one could cite a single instance where this stunt ever led to anyone actually finding anything of value. Somehow Josiah Stowell was still unaware of how he had been fooled, even though his own testimony on Smith's behalf made that so obvious to everyone else that it was damning. Joseph Smith was convicted and fined for fraud, but he was too poor to pay the fine, because he obviously couldn't really find hidden gold after all. He could pretend to give up the whereabouts and then collect his payment from some greedy gullible rube, and then get the hell out of there while someone else dug and dug and dug for it in vain. Still, the judge at the time apparently showed inappropriate leniency. He didn't want to throw Joe in jail just for being poor, so he allowed him what they called at the time leg bail, a designed escape. In other words, the judge simply let the boy go. It's too bad, too. If the judge had done what he legally should have done, we wouldn't have a Mormon church today, because 1 year later, Joseph Smith, using that same seer stone, claimed to have found the golden plates, which became the Book of Mormon. So he finally found his own gold. Oh, except that no one else ever actually got to see those golden plates. They had to be hidden away in secret for Joe's eyes only. Yeah, because people really can be that dumb, especially when faith is involved, because then you get to see things that aren't even there. Now, Just to get into the appropriate mindset of the time, and just as we today fantasize about spaceships that we haven't built yet, Americans in the early part of the 19th century fantasized about submarines, which they hadn't perfected yet. And just as we might fixate on hidden codes of one kind or another, so too did they, knowing that Egyptians had a formal language that no one yet knew how to read. Well, the Rosetta Stone had actually been deciphered in 1822, just 5 years earlier, but news traveled much more slowly back then. So Joseph Smith was as yet unaware of this in 1827 when he claimed to have found a book made of gold that was allegedly written in an imaginary language that he made up and called Reformed Egyptian. He said that this secret book that no one else but him could see was written by pre-Columbian Native Americans who were allegedly secretly Jewish immigrants and pre-Christian Christians who came to the Holy Land and came from the Holy Land to the New World aboard wooden submarines that were allegedly built around 2600 BCE. And then also an ocean-faring boat that was built around 600 BCE. Now, Joseph Smith conned another gullible rube, Martin Harris, who was wealthy enough and stupid enough to fund the translation process. And not only would he fund it, making him Joseph Smith's boss, but he would also be Smith's employee, working as his scribe over a period of translation wherein no one was allowed to see the golden plates that they're supposed to be translating. The resulting work was the Book of Mormon, which was largely a ripoff of the Bible, but with a lot of obvious fan fiction thrown in. When they finished the first book, the Book of Lehi, Martin asked to take the manuscript home with him to get his wife's approval of the investment. Martin then returned to Joseph Smith with the news that the 116-page book was lost. And most historians believe that Lucy, Martin's wife, was simply withholding the manuscript to see if Joseph could reproduce the Book of Lehi verbatim. Either that or she burned it in disgust. Either way, Joseph Smith could not reproduce it because he wasn't translating from an original document like he said. He was making it up as he went along, and he couldn't remember everything he wrote verbatim. So instead, Joseph Smith wrote 1st and 2nd Nephi to replace the Book of Lehi, and he claimed it was from the same timeline but from a different perspective. Lehi's son, Nephi, and therefore contained many of the same elements, but was written differently. A bold save, but that bullshit excuse obviously failed to convince Mrs. Harris, who was obviously much wiser than her foolish husband. So Martin was cut out of the translation process, and Oliver Cowdery took over. Yet Joseph Smith was still able to dupe Martin Harris out of more money whenever he needed it. And this is when Lucy Harris decided that she couldn't stay married to such a credulous stooge anymore. So she sued for divorce, and the Harris farm was liquidated to settle the suit and to fund the printing of the Book of Mormon. Thus, Joseph Smith established the Mormon Church. Then, at the height of Egyptomania, which was going on at the time, an artifact dealer heard that Joseph Smith could translate Egyptian. So he sold some mummies and papyri to the church, and Joseph translated the hieroglyphs, creating his own Egyptian alphabet out of the individual characters. He eventually translated one portion, the Book of Abraham, and published it in 1842, along with 3 facsimiles in the papyri. It was canonized in 1880 and remains modern Mormon scripture to this day. However, by 1855, it was known that the translation was fabricated and false. The actual papyri were common funerary rites, the text dating to more than a millennium after the biblical Abraham. The papyri that were thought to have been lost were rediscovered in the late 1960s. And Joseph's translation is nonsense. And every serious Egyptologist today rejects it. Even the church itself knows that the Book of Abraham is false because they admitted that none of the characters in the papyrus fragments mentioned Abraham's name or any of the events recorded in the Book of Abraham. The early Mormon church was dangerously militant and engaged in organized crime. Smith, for example, reportedly ran brothels where his call girls would poison his political opponents at his command, and their bodies would then feed the fishes in the river. And as he was the prophet and he could make the scriptures say whatever he wanted, just like Muhammad before him, then Joseph was allowed to have as many wives as he wanted, somewhere between 30 and 40. They could be as young as he wanted. He was caught with a 16-year-old. He married a 14-year-old. And sometimes he would simply take another man's wife as his own just because he wanted to. That's what an awful crime boss he was. Smith was arrested numerous times on various charges, but usually escaped conviction. 1830, was arrested multiple times for being a disorderly person, and then he moved from New York to Ohio, and a warrant was issued there, so he fled to Missouri. And then he was arrested. He was charged again, so he fled to Illinois. Then after the Mormon War, he was charged with treason. I'm having to speed all these up. And finally, in Illinois, he went too far when he arranged to have a mob destroy a printing press that was speaking out against him, and he was murdered while trying to escape jail for treason. Oh, and the religion he made up? Absolutely fraudulent nonsense. But we'll get into that during the discussion part of this debate.